Behind prison walls, a different justice awaits the most horrific law offenders. Their punishment doesn't end with a life sentence, it just begins. Within the harsh confines, they face a new reality where their dark pasts haunt them, and the first 24 hours behind bars are often the most harrowing moments for their new life. What could go wrong for people who have little care for law? Today, let's reveal the tragic fate of the most horrific killers in prison. Number 6. Jeffrey Dahmer. It's hard to imagine what is going on in the minds of people who have little care for the lives of other humans. Well, who can know how it's better to treat a serial violator of law than his mate? In February 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer, the notorious and prolific hitman who had confessed to the heinous murders of 17 young men and boys, arrived at Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, amidst a frenzy of media attention. The prison that would become his new home was abuzz with the news of his arrival, and officials took extraordinary measures to ensure his safety. Due to the gruesome nature of his crimes, Dahmer was placed in protective custody, isolating him from the general population to prevent potential harm from other inmates who might seek to exploit his notoriety. He was confined to a solitary cell, shackled whenever he left it, to safeguard him from the wrath of his fellow prisoners. For the first year, Dahmer's life behind bars was one of unrelenting solitude and silence. He spent his days alone in his cell, with minimal interaction with other prisoners, a stark reminder of the monstrous acts that had led him to this place. During this time, Dahmer kept to himself, immersing himself in books and writing letters, his behavior relatively calm and uneventful. However, as the months passed, Dahmer began to request more freedom of movement and interaction within the prison, seeking a taste of normalcy. After a year of isolation, prison officials granted Dahmer's request, transferring him to a unit designated for prisoners with emotional problems. This shift marked a significant change in Dahmer's prison life, allowing him to attend classes, share communal meals, and perform work duties alongside other inmates. While this increased freedom brought a semblance of normalcy, it also came with risks, as his notoriety and the nature of his crimes made him a target for those seeking to exploit his fame. Moreover, his dark sense of humor, which included macabre jokes and molding prison food to resemble severed limbs, disturbed many fellow inmates, setting the stage for future conflicts and tensions within the prison walls. As Dahmer tried to adapt to his new life, his disturbing behavior and dark humor soon led to deadly consequences. Amidst the darkness of his prison life, Dahmer began a Bible correspondence course and expressed a desire to be baptized in the spring of 1994. Roy Ratcliffe, a Church of Christ minister, visited Dahmer and agreed to help him with his conversion. On a fateful day in May 1994, Dahmer was baptized in a whirlpool bath at the prison, sparking questions about his sincerity. Despite his newfound faith, Dahmer's interactions with other inmates remained tense. In July 1994, during a chapel service, another inmate attempted to slash Dahmer's throat with a homemade weapon. The blade broke, leaving Dahmer with only a scratch. He was temporarily placed in isolation, but insisted on returning to the general population, claiming the attack was a one-time thing. Dahmer's willingness to remain among the general population puzzled many, with some believing he had a death wish. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to cleaning duty in the prison's gym bathrooms, along with Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. The three were left unsupervised for 20 minutes, and when guards returned, they found Dahmer and Anderson brutally beaten. Dahmer was pronounced dead an hour later, and Anderson succumbed to his injuries soon after. Scarver later revealed that he despised Dahmer and questioned whether prison personnel had intentionally left them alone. Some believed Dahmer's death behind bars was inevitable, with his attorney, Gerald Boyle, suggesting that Dahmer had deliberately sought out death while in prison, unable to take his own life, but expecting someone else to do it for him. If this is the case, it goes without saying that he got what he wanted in the end. Number 5. El Chapo. The notorious El Chapo's arrival at ADX Florence in 2019 marked the beginning of a harrowing new chapter in his life. On that fateful day, the infamous drug lord was transported under heavy guard to the Supermax prison, notorious for its impenetrable security and brutal living conditions. Upon arrival, El Chapo was immediately subjected to the dehumanizing intake process, a tedious and invasive procedure designed to strip away any remnants of his former life. Guards conducted a thorough strip search, inspecting every inch of his body for contraband, a humiliating process that was just the beginning of the relentless scrutiny he would face at ADX Florence. Next, he was issued his prison uniform, a stark contrast to the luxurious attire he once wore. The uniform symbolized his new identity as just another inmate in the Alcatraz of the Rockies.
Is home to one of the most notorious and bloodthirsty narco-criminals of all.
With his personal belongings confiscated and his freedom stripped away, El Chapo was escorted to his cell, a solid 7 by 12-foot concrete box that was a far cry from the high-class surroundings he was accustomed to. The bed, desk, and chair were all made of concrete and bolted to the floor, ensuring they could not be moved or used as weapons. The cell also included a toilet and a shower area, but the water was time-controlled to prevent flooding the cell. The design of the cell featured a solid outer door and an interior jail door, and a tiny window measuring 42 inches tall and 4 inches wide offered no view of the surrounding Rocky Mountains, leaving the former drug lord completely isolated. The soundproof walls ensured that he could not communicate with other inmates, further intensifying his sense of isolation. El Chapo's initial reaction to the facility was one of shock and disbelief. The extreme isolation and harsh conditions were a stark contrast to the life of power and luxury he once knew.
A murderer and a folk hero. To the Mexican government,
every aspect of his life was controlled by the guards, from the timing of his meals to the hours of light in his cell. The electricity was controlled by the guards, and lights were turned off at a specific time, plunging him into darkness and reinforcing the sense of powerlessness. For 23 hours a day, El Chapo would be confined to this cell, with only an hour for recreation. Even then, he would be taken to a concrete pit that resembled an empty swimming pool, surrounded by high walls and offering no view of the outside world. Under the watchful eyes of 3 guards, he could walk 10 steps in a straight line or 31 steps in a circle. This limited movement was designed to maintain the physical health of inmates at ADX Florence while ensuring they remained disoriented and isolated.
That we had total control of their movement to and from the areas that they had to go to.
Although many have argued that the conditions at ADX Florence are inhumane, others believe that men like Chapo deserve this kind of treatment. At the peak of his criminal career, El Chapo ruled over the Sinaloa cartel, a Mexican drug organization responsible for moving billions of dollars in marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine. When they were at their strongest, the organization controlled roughly 40% to 60% of Mexico's drug trade and earned around $3 billion annually. The sheer scale of their operations and the brutality with which they operated made El Chapo one of the most feared and reviled men in the world. El Chapo Guzman, once the most feared drug lord in the world, now confined within the impenetrable walls of America's most secure prison. Number 4. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein's incarceration was marked by a series of extraordinary privileges that starkly defied the norms of the justice system. While most convicted molestation offenders in Florida are sent to state prison, Epstein was afforded the luxury of being housed in a private wing of the Palm Beach County Stockade, a highly unusual arrangement that raised many eyebrows and sparked widespread criticism. Unlike other inmates, who are typically processed through a tedious and invasive intake procedure that includes strip searches, medical evaluations, and orientation, Epstein's arrival was handled with a level of discretion and care that was unprecedented. He was immediately whisked away to a private wing of the facility, far removed from the general inmate population, and treated with a level of deference that was not afforded to others. Epstein, a financier with deep ties to the world's elite, had become infamous for his heinous crimes involving the exploitation of underage girls, and his lenient treatment only added to the outrage. In June 2008, Epstein pleaded guilty to procuring a minor for prostitution, a plea deal that was highly controversial and criticized for being far too lenient given the severity and scope of his crimes. In exchange for his guilty plea, Epstein received an 18-month prison sentence, a year of probation, and was required to register as a law offender, a sentence that was shockingly light considering the scale and nature of his offenses. The plea deal also included a non-prosecution agreement that granted immunity to any potential co-conspirators, effectively shielding many of Epstein's associates from facing justice and leaving many victims without closure. After serving just 3.5 months behind bars, the sheriff's office claimed that Epstein was allowed to leave the jail on work release for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, a clear violation of the sheriff's own policies and a further example of the preferential treatment he received. Epstein's cell door was left unlocked, giving him freedom within the facility, and he had access to the attorney room, where a television was installed for his comfort. Later, he was moved to the stockade's previously unstaffed infirmary, further isolating him from the general inmate population and highlighting the stark contrast between his experience and that of other inmates. These accommodations made for Epstein were far from the harsh conditions faced by most inmates, and served as a stark reminder of the power of wealth and influence in the justice system. During his work release, Epstein enjoyed a unique arrangement, working at the office of a foundation he had established shortly before reporting to jail. The sheriff's office received a substantial payment of $128,000 from Epstein's nonprofit to cover the costs of extra services provided during his work release. His office was monitored by permit deputies, whose overtime was generously paid by Epstein. These deputies, dressed in suits, checked in and welcomed guests at the front desk, creating a sense of normalcy and respectability. However, the guest logs, which could have provided crucial information about Epstein's activities, were later destroyed per the department's records retention rules, although the stockade visitor logs were preserved. Epstein's privileges extended far beyond the jail walls, showcasing his immense influence. He was allowed to use his own driver to transport him between jail, his office, and other appointments, a level of freedom unheard of for a convicted molestation offender. He served almost 13 months before being released on July 22, 2009, marking the beginning of a year of probation on house arrest until August 2010. Even during his probation, Epstein enjoyed freedoms that were not typically granted to others in his position. He was allowed numerous trips on his corporate jet to his residences in Manhattan and the United States Virgin Islands, as well as long shopping trips and leisurely walks around Palm Beach for exercise. The leniency of Epstein's sentencing and the extraordinary conditions of his incarceration were a stark reminder of how power and influence can corrupt the justice system, raising questions about equality and fairness. Although Epstein's initial jail sentence was filled with luxuries and special privileges, his next prison term was a stark contrast. He was held among the general population, apart from the times when he was placed on suicide watch, a far cry from his previous experience. In a dark turn of events, he ultimately met a tragic end, found dead on August 10, 2019. Number 3. Jose Antonio Poes and Manuel Castrillon. The first day of detention for Jose Antonio, Poes and Manuel Castrillon was a harrowing and unforgettable experience that would leave an indelible mark on their lives. After being detained by soldiers and taken to a jail in El Salvador, their ordeal began with a series of dehumanizing humiliations and harsh treatments that would test their resolve and push them to the brink of despair. Upon arrival at the jail, Poes and Castrillon were subjected to a degrading strip search, a process that left them feeling exposed, vulnerable, and utterly powerless. The officials photographed every inch of their bodies, paying particular attention to their tattoos, which are often associated with gang affiliations in El Salvador, further heightening their fear and anxiety. This scrutiny only added to their sense of unease and foreboding. After the humiliating search, the men were thrown into a small, overcrowded cell with approximately 25 other detainees, where they were forced to endure inhumane conditions that would be etched in their memories forever. The cell was dimly lit, with barely enough space for everyone to sit, let alone lie down, and the air was thick with the stench of sweat, fear, and desperation. The walls seemed to close in on them, making it hard to breathe, and the sense of claustrophobia was overwhelming. "We were confused, terrified, and couldn't sleep," Poes recalled, his voice still shaking with emotion as he remembered the tragic experience. According to the men, the other detainees were just as scared and confused as they were, and the sense of collective fear was palpable. The guards patrolled the jail with an iron fist, their presence a constant reminder of the power they held over the detainees, and any attempt to speak or move without permission was met with harsh punishment, further eroding their sense of dignity and hope. The cell in which the men were kept had no toilet, only a bucket in the corner that served as a makeshift latrine, and sleep was a luxury they could not afford. The overcrowded conditions made it impossible to find a comfortable position, and the constant noise and fear kept them awake, their minds racing with thoughts of uncertainty and dread. The emotional toll of their first day in detention was immense, and Poes and Castrillon were filled with a sense of helplessness, having come to El Salvador with dreams of a better future, only to find themselves trapped in a living nightmare from which they couldn't awaken. Jose Antonio Potes and Manuel Castrillon grew up as childhood friends in a small, tranquil town in Valle del Cauca, Colombia, where they shared dreams of a brighter future beyond the borders of their hometown. Both 27 years old, they were determined to find better opportunities to support their families. Potes, a skilled welder, and Castrillon, an expert in mechanized farming, had heard glowing reports about El Salvador's transformation under President Nayib Bukele, which painted a picture of a safe, prosperous, and tech-friendly paradise free from the grip of gang violence. El Salvador's ambitious plans to become a tech powerhouse and its dramatic drop in violence made it an attractive destination for many seeking a fresh start. Potes and Castrillon believed they could thrive in this new environment, sending dollars back home to their families and building a better life for themselves. On January 2023, Potes and Castrillon set out on their journey, filled with excitement and anticipation. Potes flew out to join Castrillon, who had arrived in El Salvador earlier. Their enthusiasm was palpable as they envisioned the opportunities that awaited them in this new land. On the 21st of January, the day after Potes arrived, the two friends met for lunch in Soyapango, a bustling satellite town just outside the Salvadoran capital. They were eager to explore their new surroundings and discuss their plans for the future, but their dreams were abruptly shattered. Shortly after their meal, soldiers approached them, demanding to see their documents. Despite presenting their papers and explaining their intentions, the soldiers were not convinced. The situation quickly escalated, and Potes and Castrillon were detained without any clear explanation, leaving them confused, terrified, and helpless. Unable to comprehend why they were being treated like criminals, the soldiers accused them of being involved in narco-trafficking, a baseless claim that only added to their distress and anxiety. 8 hours later, Potes and Castrillon found themselves in a jail, marking the beginning of their harrowing ordeal. After their initial detention, the two friends were transferred to Ilopango prison, a notorious facility infamous for its inhumane conditions. Ilopango prison was their first stop in a journey through hell, where they encountered overcrowded cells filled with hundreds of detainees, far exceeding the prison's capacity. The lack of space meant that inmates had to sleep in shifts, with some standing while others lay on the cold, hard floor. The conditions in Ilopango prison were unsanitary, with no proper toilets or running water, forcing inmates to use buckets as makeshift latrines, leading to the spread of diseases. The food was scarce and often inedible, leaving many malnourished and weak. The guards maintained control through fear and intimidation, making life even more unbearable. After a month in Ilopango, Potes and Castrillon were transferred to Chucuapa prison, a place that would prove to be equally hellish, if not more so. At Chucuapa, they shared a cell with 400 other inmates, where the conditions were deplorable, with no toilets and just a single bucket to use. The overcrowding was even more severe, and the lack of basic amenities made survival a daily struggle. The tragic fate of Potes and Castrillon is not unique, as thousands of innocent people have been caught up in President Nayib Bukele's crackdown on gangs. While the government claims to have jailed nearly 70,000 gang members, human rights groups argue that many of those detained are innocent, highlighting a grave injustice. Number 2, Ryan Archer. Sometimes it takes paying for one's sins before one can truly reflect on life and how they have lived it. Despite being behind bars, Ryan Archer tried to maintain a positive outlook, a testament to his resilience and determination. While serving his time at Reidsville State Prison, he kept in touch with his family, especially his father, Michael Archer, who remained a constant source of support and guidance. Michael last spoke to his son Ryan on December 11, 2023, just 2 days before Ryan's life would come to a tragic and untimely end. During that call, Ryan mentioned that he was having some trouble inside, but his tone sounded optimistic, a hint of hope that belied the dangers that lurked beneath the surface. Michael sensed that his son wasn't telling him everything, likely to prevent his family from worrying about his safety and well-being. Ryan's time at Reidsville was filled with challenges, a harsh and unforgiving environment where inmates often face violence, intimidation, and exploitation. His most recent mugshot showed visible bruising on his face, a stark indication that he had been involved in altercations or had been physically mistreated, a painful reminder of the brutal reality of prison life. On December 12, Ryan was abruptly transferred from Reidsville to Coastal State Prison in Garden City, a move that would prove to be fatal. Transfers like these are not uncommon, but they can be a double-edged sword, offering a chance to escape immediate threats while also bringing new dangers and uncertainties. For Ryan, this transfer would mark the beginning of his final tragic chapter. a devastating conclusion to a life that had been marked by struggles and hardships. The reasons behind Ryan's transfer remain unclear, but it is speculated that he may have been trying to escape a dangerous situation at Reedsville, a desperate bid to leave behind the conflicts, debts, and gang politics that had haunted him. Unfortunately for Ryan, whatever trouble he was trying to leave behind eventually caught up with him, a relentless pursuit that would ultimately claim his life. Ryan Archer's first 24 hours at Coastal State Prison were a traumatic and ultimately fatal experience, marked by a series of events that would prove to be catastrophic. Upon his arrival, he was thrust into an environment filled with tension and danger, where the air was thick with hostility and aggression. The transfer from Reedsville to Coastal State Prison was supposed to offer a fresh start, a chance for Ryan to leave his past mistakes behind and begin anew. However, it quickly became evident that Ryan was not safe, and that his presence in the prison would be met with resistance and violence. As soon as Ryan stepped off the transport vehicle, he was processed and assigned to a cell, where he would be forced to navigate a complex web of alliances and rivalries. The intake process at Coastal State Prison is notoriously rigorous, involving thorough searches, medical evaluations, and a series of questions aimed at assessing the inmate's mental and physical state. Ryan, already showing signs of previous altercations, likely went through this process with a sense of unease and trepidation. In Ryan's new cell, tensions ran high, and the inmates in his section of the prison saw him as a potential target because of his visible bruises and recent transfer. Within hours of his arrival, Ryan began to sense the hostility around him, and he knew that he had to be constantly on guard. It is common practice for inmates to size up newcomers, and Ryan was no exception. The prison gossip mill is incredibly efficient, and word of his transfer likely spread quickly, drawing attention to him from those who might seek to do him harm. Any unresolved issues from Reedsville could have followed him, making him a target for those looking to settle scores. The exact details of the events leading up to Ryan's death remain unclear, but it is known that he was involved in an altercation with another inmate, a fight that would prove to be fatal. Witnesses reported hearing raised voices and the sounds of a struggle, and by the time prison staff arrived, it was too late. Ryan was found severely injured, with multiple wounds indicating a violent struggle. Despite the efforts of the prison medical staff, he succumbed to his injuries shortly after the altercation, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a community in mourning. Before his tragic passing, Ryan Archer, a 26-year-old man from Griffin, Georgia, had a life that took a dark turn when he was only a teenager. Growing up, Ryan was known to be a bright and ambitious individual, but like many, he fell into the wrong crowd and made some poor decisions that would alter his life forever. Ryan's criminal record began with minor infractions, but it quickly escalated, and he was eventually convicted of possession of substances and a firearm, serious charges that landed him a 10-year sentence. According to court records, Ryan was caught with a significant amount of illegal substances and an unregistered firearm during a routine traffic stop. The evidence was overwhelming, and he was sentenced to serve 2 years of the 10, with a maximum release date set for June 2024. In the aftermath of the tragic incident, the Georgia Department of Corrections launched an internal review to determine the circumstances that led to the fatal altercation. This investigation aimed to identify the individuals involved and understand how such a violent event could occur within hours of Ryan's transfer to Coastal State Prison. Prison authorities were quick to release a statement confirming Ryan's death and the initiation of the investigation on December 13th. However, the details provided were vague, leaving many questions unanswered and a community demanding justice. The loss of Ryan was not just a personal tragedy for his family, but also a painful reminder of the dangers faced by inmates within the prison system. Ryan's daughter, who he had hoped to reunite with upon his release, would now grow up without her father, a victim of a system that failed to protect him. The wider community also felt the impact of Ryan's death, and advocacy groups and organizations dedicated to prison reform seized upon the incident as a rallying cry for change, calling for increased transparency and accountability within the prison system. Number 1. Naum. Naum, a 28-year-old man, had always grappled with his inner demons. Growing up in a tough neighborhood, he was all too familiar with the harsh realities of life. Despite his best efforts to stay on the straight and narrow, Naum found himself entangled in a web of substance addiction and financial desperation. The impending birth of his daughter weighed heavily on his mind, and the pressure to provide for his growing family was overwhelming. His wife's pregnancy had brought a new sense of urgency to his situation, and Naum felt like he was running out of options. On a fateful Saturday evening, Naum made a decision that would change his life forever. High on cocaine and desperate for a solution, he decided to rob a bar, believing that this was the only way to provide for his loved ones. Armed with a plastic gun that looked deceptively real, Naum set out to commit the crime. He stormed into the bar, waving the plastic gun and demanding money. The patrons and the bar owner were terrified, unable to distinguish the fake weapon from a real one. Brazilian law makes no distinction between real and toy weapons in the context of a crime, and Naum's actions were about to have severe consequences. Unknown to Naum, the police were already on their way, responding to a tip from a concerned citizen. Within minutes, the police arrived, surrounding the bar and cutting off any chance of escape. Naum was arrested on the spot, his pleas of innocence falling on deaf ears. "I've done nothing wrong. It's a misunderstanding," he told authorities, but the evidence was stacked against him. The plastic gun, though light and fake, had caused real fear and panic among the bar's patrons. At the police station, Naum's situation became even more critical. He admitted to having a substance problem and acknowledged that he sometimes drank too much hard drink, hoping for leniency. Despite his admissions, the police saw things differently. Naum was charged with aggravated robbery, a crime that could land him up to 15 years behind bars, a prospect that filled him with dread and uncertainty. Naum's thoughts immediately turned to his family. "I'm desperate. My family really needs me at the moment," he lamented. His wife was due to give birth any day now, and he feared missing the birth of his daughter. But instead of going back to his family, Naum was sent to a pre-trial prison, where he would remain until a judge decided his fate. Even for a seemingly small-time criminal like Naum, the security measures were extreme. Brazil, with the world's second-largest substance market after the USA, is a battleground for police and substance gangs. Every prisoner transport is heavily guarded, and Naum's journey to the Porto Valley prison complex was no exception. Upon arrival, Naum was placed in a cage, awaiting his video conference hearing with a judge. The heat was unbearable, the conditions inhumane, yet Naum clung to hope, believing he might be released soon. But the waiting began, and Naum's fate hung in the balance. The next morning, Naum faced the judge via video conference. His hopes were dashed when the bar owner, the alleged victim, unexpectedly testified against him. He had hoped the bar owner would not testify, and so there would be no evidence, but this was not the case. After hearing the case, the judge revealed that the final decision on whether to press charges would come by mail, leaving Naum in a state of uncertainty. Naum, unable to afford a lawyer, could do nothing but wait. If convicted, he would be transferred to the maximum security prison known as 603, a fortress with the highest security standards in the country. Although inmates have different experiences behind bars, the one thing that remains consistent is that the lack of freedom will change the course of their lives forever. Naum's story serves as a poignant reminder of the harsh realities of life behind bars and the devastating consequences of desperation. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.